Picture this: a woman who married 2 kings, gave birth to 2 more, commanded armies, survived 16 years of imprisonment, and at nearly 80 years old, rode across the Pyrenees in winter to personally secure the future of Europe. A woman who held more land than the King of France himself, who defied popes and emperors, who funded crusades and fostered revolutions. A woman so powerful, so dangerous, that even centuries after her death, her name alone evokes images of intrigue, passion, and political genius. This is Eleanor of Aquitaine, and by the time we're done here, you'll understand why she wasn't just remarkable for her time, she was dangerous, genuinely, terrifyingly dangerous to anyone who stood in her way. But to understand Eleanor's danger, we need to go back to the beginning, to a world where women were expected to be silent, obedient, and above all decorative. Eleanor would be none of these things. Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep historical journeys, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's learning with us from around the world. So settle in, get comfortable, and travel with me back to the 12th century. Around the year 1122, somewhere in the sun-drenched lands of southwestern France, a girl was born who would reshape the map of Europe. Her name was Eleanor, though history would remember her as Eleanor. She arrived into a world of troubadours and castles, of sophisticated courts where poetry flowed as freely as wine, where the Languedoc rang out in songs of love and valour. This was Aquitaine, one of the largest and wealthiest territories in all of France, stretching from the Loire River to the foothills of the Pyrenees, from the heights of Auvergne to the Western Ocean. Her father was William X, Duke of Aquitaine and Count of Poitiers, a man who possessed domains larger than those held by the King of France himself. Let that sink in for a moment. The vassal was richer and more powerful than his supposed lord. This wasn't unusual in medieval France, where the king's actual power barely extended beyond the Ile-de-France, but it sets the stage for everything that follows. Eleanor wasn't born into minor nobility. She was born into one of the great power centres of medieval Europe. Her grandfather was the legendary William IX, perhaps the first troubadour, a warrior poet whose verses would influence the development of romantic poetry throughout Europe. This wasn't a family of dour pious monks counting their sins. This was a family of warriors, poets, lovers, and politicians who understood that power came in many forms. They understood spectacle, they understood culture, they understood that controlling hearts and minds was just as important as controlling castles and armies. Eleanor's mother was Eleanor de Châtellerault, and Eleanor's name itself tells a story. Eleanor means the other, Eleanor suggesting that she may have been the first woman to carry this name. She grew up in a household that was, by the standards of the 12th century, almost shockingly progressive in its treatment of its daughters. While most noble girls were taught little beyond spinning, weaving, and household management, Eleanor received an education that would shame many of her male contemporaries. She was fluent in Latin, the language of scholarship and the church. She could read and write, skills that were far from universal even among the nobility. She was trained in music, in poetry, in the arts of conversation and debate. She learned to hunt and hawk, the sports of kings. She was taught the intricacies of managing vast estates, of understanding the complex web of feudal obligations that bound lord to vassal. Her father wasn't preparing her to be some man's ornament. He was preparing her to rule, and rule she would need to do, because in April of 1137, when Eleanor was just 15 years old, Duke William X died while on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. With her mother already dead and her younger sister Petronilla still a child, Eleanor suddenly found herself Duchess of Aquitaine and Countess of Poitiers, one of the wealthiest and most powerful heiresses in all of Europe. This was an extraordinarily dangerous position for a young woman to be in. Medieval Europe was not a place where wealthy, unmarried women could expect to remain unmolested for long. Kidnapping and forced marriage was a real and constant threat. An ambitious nobleman needed only to seize Eleanor, force her to marry him, and suddenly all of Aquitaine would be his. William X had known this. As he lay dying, he entrusted Eleanor to the protection of King Louis VI of France, known as Louis the Fat. Louis the Fat moved with remarkable speed. Within weeks he had arranged for Eleanor to marry his own son and heir, also named Louis. This wasn't just a marriage. This was a masterstroke of political genius. At a single blow, the French crown would gain control of Aquitaine, doubling the territory under its direct influence. The wedding took place on July 25th, 1137, in the Cathedral of Saint-André at Bordeaux. Eleanor was 15. Her husband was 16. They barely had time to know each other before tragedy struck. Within a month of the wedding, on August 8th, King Louis the Fat died. Suddenly, Eleanor's teenage husband was Louis VII, King of France, and Eleanor herself was Queen of France. At 15 years old, she was one of the most powerful women in Europe, and she had absolutely no intention of being quiet about it. The early years of Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII reveal a fundamental incompatibility that would eventually tear their union apart. Louis had never been meant to be king. He had been groomed from childhood for the clergy, destined for a life of prayer and contemplation in the monastery of Saint-Denis. Only, the accidental death of his older brother Philip had pulled him from his intended path and thrust the crown onto his head. He was, by all accounts, a gentle, pious, submissive man who seemed constantly in awe of his beautiful, vibrant, worldly wife. Eleanor was everything Louis was not. Where he was contemplative, she was vivacious. Where he was pious, she was worldly. Where he was cautious, she was bold. She had grown up in the sophisticated courts of Aquitaine, where troubadours sang of love and adventure, where her grandfather had written some of the first romantic poetry in the vernacular. She had travelled extensively with her father, learning the arts of governance and diplomacy. She was not content to sit quietly in the background while men made decisions. Louis, for his part, appears to have been deeply, genuinely in love with his wife. But love and compatibility are not the same thing, and Eleanor quickly began to exert considerable influence over her husband. She encouraged him, often goaded him, into undertaking ventures that his more cautious advisers would never have recommended. She made the French court a centre of culture and sophistication, filling it with troubadours from the south and trouvères from the north, with poets and musicians and scholars. But beneath the glittering surface, trouble was brewing. Eleanor had brought her own vassals with her from Aquitaine, and they often clashed with the northern French nobles at Louis's court. The sophisticated worldly southerners looked down on what they saw as the provincial manners of the north. The northern nobles, in turn, viewed the southerners as frivolous and undisciplined. And then there was the matter of an heir. Eleanor had 2 daughters by Louis, Marie, born in 1145, and Alix, born in 1150. But no sons. In an age where royal succession was everything, where the stability of a kingdom depended on a clear line of male inheritance, this was a serious problem. Medieval society, steeped in misogyny, typically blamed the woman in such situations, though we now know that the determination of a child's sex has nothing to do with the mother. The tensions came to a head in an event that would haunt Louis for the rest of his life. Eleanor's younger sister Petronilla had caused a scandal at the French court by running away with and marrying Raoul of Vermandois, despite the inconvenient fact that Raoul was already married to the niece of the Count of Champagne. Both lovers were excommunicated, and the Count of Champagne, understandably furious, went to war. Louis, supporting his wife's sister, invaded Champagne. During the siege of the town of Vitry in 1143, Louis's soldiers set fire to a church where some 1,300 men, women and children had sought sanctuary. Every single one of them burned to death. The massacre haunted Louis. He was overcome with guilt, plagued by nightmares, convinced that God was punishing him. His advisers suggested penance. The Pope suggested a crusade. When Pope Eugene III called for a Second Crusade in 1145 to rescue the Christian states in the Holy Land after the fall of Edessa, Louis leaped at the chance. Here was an opportunity for redemption, a way to atone for the horror at Vitry. Eleanor, for her part, had very different motivations. She wasn't seeking spiritual redemption. She was seeking adventure. Eleanor announced that she would accompany Louis on crusade, taking the cross alongside him. This was virtually unheard of. Queens did not go on crusade. The journey was long, dangerous, and brutal. But Eleanor was determined, and she brought with her 300 ladies in waiting and a substantial contingent of knights from Aquitaine. Some chroniclers, dripping with disapproval, described her and her ladies as dressing like Amazons, these warrior women of legend. The Second Crusade, which lasted from 1147 to 1149, was an unmitigated disaster from almost every conceivable angle, and Eleanor's role in it would become the stuff of scandal, legend, and endless historical debate that continues to this day. The preparations for the crusade took months. Bernard of Clairvaux, the charismatic Cistercian monk who had been instrumental in preaching the crusade, travelled throughout France drumming up support. Louis threw himself into the preparations with the fervour of a true believer seeking redemption. Eleanor, meanwhile, organised her own contingent. She didn't just decide to tag along with her husband. She took the cross as Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, bringing with her not just those 300 ladies but also a substantial force of knights from Aquitaine, men who owed their feudal allegiance to her, not to Louis. The departure in June 1147 was spectacular. Thousands of crusaders assembled, many having sold their land and possessions to finance the journey. They believed they were embarking on a holy mission that would win them glory in this life and salvation in the next. The reality would be far grimmer. The journey to the Holy Land was supposed to take them through Germany, where they would meet up with the German crusaders under Emperor Conrad III, then through Byzantine territory, across Anatolia, and finally to the Christian states of Outremer. On paper, it looked straightforward. In practice, it was a logistical nightmare. Louis, who had virtually no experience in military leadership, and even less in the logistics of moving large armies across hostile territory, proved to be a spectacularly ineffective commander. He had spent his youth preparing for the clergy, not for war. He knew how to pray, how to contemplate scripture, how to perform the rituals of the church. He did not know how to manage supply lines, coordinate with allied forces, or make the hard tactical decisions that military campaigns demand. Eleanor, on the other hand, was routinely praised by those who were actually there for her strength, wisdom, and leadership during the journey. She kept her own troops disciplined and organised while Louis's forces struggled with desertion and disorder. The Aquitanian contingent maintained good order and morale, suggesting that Eleanor had learned something from her father about military leadership and logistics. The first major disaster came when they reached Byzantine territory. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel Comnenus was supposed to be an ally, but the relationship between the Western Crusaders and the Byzantine Greeks was complicated, fraught with mutual suspicion and cultural misunderstanding. The Germans had already passed through Constantinople, and reports filtering back suggested they had suffered a major defeat at the hands of the Turks. When the French arrived, Manuel was less than welcoming, eager to move these potentially dangerous armed forces through his territory as quickly as possible. The Crusaders' journey through Anatolia was a nightmare that defies easy description. They were harassed constantly by Turkish forces who had perfected the art of the ambush and the tactical retreat. These were not set-piece battles where European cavalry could charge and overwhelm their enemies. These were hit-and-run attacks, arrows from the hills, supply trains cut off, stragglers picked off one by one. Supply lines broke down almost immediately. The Crusaders had vastly underestimated the difficulties of feeding an army of thousands as it marched through hostile, often barren territory. Men died of starvation, disease, and enemy arrows in equal measure. The journey became a death march, with bodies littering the trail behind them. Some crusaders deserted, turning back or simply disappearing into the wilderness. Others lost their minds, driven mad by hunger, thirst, and constant fear. The disaster at Mount Cadmus in January 1148 was the low point of the journey. The Crusader army had to cross this mountain pass in Anatolia to reach the comparative safety of the coast. Eleanor, who was with the vanguard, encouraged them to push ahead to secure the pass while Louis and the main body of the army followed behind. This decision has been the subject of controversy for nearly 900 years. What exactly happened is disputed. Some sources suggest that Eleanor's vanguard pushed ahead too fast, leaving Louis and the main army vulnerable. Others suggest that Louis delayed too long, allowing the vanguard to get dangerously far ahead. What's not disputed is the result. The vanguard made it through the pass safely and camped on the far side. The main army, caught in the pass with night falling, was ambushed by Turkish forces. The ambush was devastating. Thousands of crusaders were killed. Louis's personal bodyguard was cut down trying to protect him. Louis himself barely escaped, reportedly climbing a tree to hide from Turkish soldiers. It was a humiliating defeat that shattered what remained of the Crusaders' morale and decimated their numbers. Medieval chroniclers, who had already demonstrated their disapproval of Eleanor's presence on the crusade, blamed her for the disaster at Mount Cadmus. They accused her of behaving as though she were going to a party rather than a military campaign, of bringing excessive baggage that slowed the army down, of distracting the troops with her beauty and the presence of all those ladies in waiting. They suggested that her pride and vanity had caused the deaths of thousands of good Christian soldiers. These same chroniclers conveniently ignored several inconvenient facts. First, Eleanor's own forces remained disciplined and effective throughout the journey, while Louis's forces fell apart. Second, the decision about how to handle the crossing of Mount Cadmus was a military decision that should have been made by military commanders, not by a queen accompanying the expedition. Third, if Eleanor's baggage train was so excessive and so problematic, why didn't Louis, as commander of the expedition, do something about it? The answer is that Eleanor made a convenient scapegoat. The crusade was failing, thousands were dying, and someone needed to be blamed. Blaming Louis himself was problematic because he was the King of France and God's anointed representative. Blaming the military commanders raised uncomfortable questions about why Louis had chosen incompetent commanders. But blaming Eleanor, a woman who shouldn't have been there in the first place according to medieval ideas about women's proper roles, that was easy. That let everyone off the hook. The Crusaders finally reached the Holy Land in 1148, arriving at the city of Antioch in March. Antioch was ruled by Raymond of Poitiers, Eleanor's uncle and the brother of her late father. This is where things get complicated, scandalous and ultimately catastrophic for Eleanor's marriage to Louis. Raymond welcomed his niece with open arms and lavish hospitality. The court at Antioch spoke the Languedoc, Eleanor's native language. The customs were those of the Languedoc. For the first time since leaving Aquitaine, Eleanor was among her own people, in a place that felt like home. She and her uncle developed a close relationship very quickly, spending long hours together discussing politics, strategy, and the situation in the Holy Land. This closeness did not escape Louis's notice. He became jealous, then suspicious. Chroniclers, always eager for scandal, began to whisper about an affair between Eleanor and her uncle. Whether there was actually a sexual relationship between them is something we'll never know for certain. The evidence is contradictory, and often comes from sources with their own agendas. What we do know is that their relationship was close enough, and conducted publicly enough, that it aroused Louis's jealousy and gave his enemies at court ammunition to use against Eleanor. But the real crisis came not from any alleged affair, but from a fundamental disagreement about military strategy. Raymond wanted the Crusaders to attack Aleppo and recover the county of Edessa, which would secure Antioch's vulnerable eastern frontier. This was, militarily speaking, the sensible course of action. It was also what the Pope had originally called for. But Louis had other plans. He insisted on continuing to Jerusalem itself a pilgrimage, despite the fact that Jerusalem was not under immediate threat, and attacking it would accomplish nothing strategically. Eleanor sided with her uncle. She argued publicly and forcefully that Louis should follow Raymond's military advice. For a wife, let alone a queen, to openly contradict and argue with her husband in public was shocking behaviour. Medieval society had very strict ideas about a woman's proper role, and that role did not include military strategy debates. The chroniclers John of Salisbury and William of Tyre later wrote that Eleanor was behaving not as a wife or queen should, but as a man, even as a king. The argument escalated. When Louis remained adamant about going to Jerusalem, Eleanor made a stunning announcement. She would remain in Antioch with her uncle. She would not continue with Louis. Since the bulk of the fighting forces were Eleanor's own vassals from Aquitaine, this was essentially an ultimatum. Louis could go to Jerusalem if he wanted, but he would go without an army. Louis was cornered. He couldn't allow his wife to remain in Antioch, couldn't allow her to humiliate him so publicly, so he took the only option he felt was available to him. In the middle of the night, he had Eleanor seized by force and carried out of the city. They left Antioch abruptly, dramatically, and Eleanor never saw her uncle Raymond again. He would be killed in battle against Muslim forces just a year later, his head sent as a trophy to the Caliph in Baghdad. The relationship between Louis and Eleanor never recovered. They continued to Jerusalem, where Louis's crusade achieved precisely nothing. The Crusaders laid siege to Damascus, a city that had actually been allied with the Christian states, turned it into an enemy, and then were forced to retreat after just 4 days of fighting. It was a complete debacle. The Second Crusade failed in every measurable way, and Louis, though he tried to blame others, bore much of the responsibility. On the journey home, travelling separately, Eleanor learned that Raymond had been killed. When she finally reunited with Louis in Italy, they met with Pope Eugene, who had been informed of their marital problems. The question of annulment was raised. Eleanor and Louis were third cousins, which made them related within the prohibited degrees according to church law. This consanguinity could be grounds for annulment. But Eugene denied the request. He declared the marriage legitimate and urged the couple to reconcile. He even ordered them to share a bed, hoping that the intimacy would heal the rift between them. Whether this papal intervention worked temporarily or not, it was clear that the marriage was beyond saving. Eleanor had not given Louis a son, she had humiliated him in Antioch, and the two were fundamentally incompatible. Finally, in March of 1152, after 15 years of marriage, the annulment was granted on the grounds of consanguinity. Their 2 daughters were declared legitimate. Custody was awarded to Louis, and Eleanor's lands were restored to her. At 30 years old, Eleanor of Aquitaine was once again Duchess of Aquitaine, in her own right, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe. And she was, technically, available for marriage once more. The problem was that Eleanor didn't want to get married again. She had been Queen of France. She had seen the world. She had commanded armies. She had no desire to become some nobleman's property, to surrender her independence and her lands to a new husband. But this was the 12th century, and wealthy unmarried women were targets. Within weeks of her annulment, attempts were made to kidnap her and force her into marriage. She had to flee from one would-be abductor, Geoffrey of Anjou, narrowly escaping his grasp. But Geoffrey wasn't the only Angevin who had his eye on the wealthiest heiress in Europe. His older brother Henry, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, was also interested. And unlike Geoffrey, Henry had something to offer beyond just ambition and land hunger. Henry Plantagenet was everything Louis wasn't. Where Louis had been pious and contemplative, Henry was energetic and worldly. Where Louis had been gentle and submissive, Henry was forceful and commanding. Where Louis had been indecisive, Henry was a man of immediate action. He was also 10 years younger than Eleanor, a fact that would raise eyebrows then and continues to raise them now. But age gap aside, Henry was a spectacular catch. Through his mother Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England, he had a claim to the English throne. He already controlled Normandy and Anjou. If he married Eleanor, he would gain Aquitaine as well. Together, they would command an empire stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, encompassing more of France than the French king controlled. The sources suggest that Eleanor was the one who initiated the match. She sent an envoy to Henry, essentially proposing to him. Whether this was born of genuine attraction, political calculation, or simply a desire to marry someone who could protect her from other suitors, we'll never know. Probably it was all three. The marriage took place in May 1152, just 2 months after her annulment from Louis. The speed was shocking, scandalous even. Rumours immediately began to circulate that Eleanor and Henry had been involved before her annulment, though there's no real evidence of this. The marriage was also technically just as consanguineous as her marriage to Louis had been. Henry and Eleanor were also related within the prohibited degrees, but unlike with Louis, no one seemed interested in bringing this up. The marriage was too politically valuable to both parties. The creation of what historians would later call the Angevin Empire was complete. Henry had Normandy, Anjou, and through Eleanor Aquitaine. Within 2 years, he would add England to his territories when King Stephen died, and Henry ascended the English throne as Henry II. England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, all under one ruler. It was the most powerful political union in Western Europe, rivaling even the Holy Roman Empire in size and wealth, and Eleanor was at the centre of it all. The early years of Eleanor's marriage to Henry II seem to have been relatively happy, or at least productive. Unlike with Louis, Eleanor quickly provided Henry with sons, many sons. Their first child, William, was born in 1153 but tragically died at the age of 3, but there would be others. Henry the young king, born in 1150, Matilda, born in 1156, Richard, who would become known as the Lionheart, born in 1157, Geoffrey, born in 1158, Eleanor, born in 1162, Joanna, born in 1165, and finally John, born in 1167, who would be nicknamed Lackland, until he outlived all his brothers and inherited the throne. 8 children in 14 years. Eleanor had proven definitively that the failure to produce sons in her marriage to Louis was not her fault. She had given Henry 5 sons and 3 daughters, securing the Plantagenet succession multiple times over. This was her duty as queen accomplished spectacularly. But Eleanor was never content to be merely a broodmare, even a successful one. Throughout these years she remained politically active, participating in the administration of the realm, and even more actively in the management of her own domains in Aquitaine. When Henry was occupied elsewhere, Eleanor acted as regent, issuing charters, settling disputes, managing the complex web of feudal relationships that held the Angevin Empire together. She also made the court at Poitiers, where she spent much of her time, into one of the great cultural centres of Europe. This is where the legend of Eleanor as the Queen of Courtly Love really takes hold, though we need to be careful about separating fact from fiction here. The legend says that Eleanor and her daughter Marie, Countess of Champagne, presided over courts of love at Poitiers between 1168 and 1173, where lovers would bring their romantic dilemmas to be judged by a jury of noblewomen. These courts supposedly codified the rules of courtly love, creating an entire social system around the proper way for knights to court ladies. It's a beautiful legend, very romantic, very appealing. It's also probably not true, at least not in the form the legend describes. The main source for these courts of love is a book called The Art of Courtly Love by Andreas Capellanus, a chaplain at the court. But Andreas's book is more of a literary fiction, a kind of etiquette guide dressed up as a collection of case studies than an actual historical record. There's no corroborating evidence that these formal courts ever actually took place. But the legend persists for good reasons. Eleanor did maintain a glittering court at Poitiers. Troubadours did flock there, including the famous Bernard de Ventadour, who wrote passionate songs declaring Eleanor the most beautiful woman in the world. The ideals of chivalry and courtly love did flourish there. The court did become famous throughout Europe as a centre of sophisticated culture. Eleanor's grandfather had been the first troubadour, Her court carried on that tradition. What we can say with certainty is that Eleanor was a major patron of the arts and literature during this period. She supported poets, musicians, and scholars. She commissioned works of history and romance. She encouraged the development of Arthurian literature, those stories of King Arthur and his knights that would become central to the medieval imagination. Her court was a place where women had more freedom, more voice, more power than was typical in medieval society. This alone would have been enough to generate legends. But even as Eleanor built her cultural legacy at Poitiers, her marriage to Henry was deteriorating. Henry was a serial adulterer, constantly taking mistresses. The most famous of these was Rosamond Clifford, known as Fair Rosamond, with whom Henry conducted a long and very public affair. Legend says that Eleanor eventually poisoned Rosamond, but this is almost certainly fiction. Rosamond died in 1176, probably of natural causes, and Eleanor was imprisoned at the time. The real problem wasn't Henry's infidelity. Eleanor, given her own complicated romantic history, was probably not that concerned about her husband's sexual adventures. The real problem was power. Henry was increasingly unwilling to allow Eleanor any real authority, especially in Aquitaine. He wanted to control her lands directly, to manage them himself, and this Eleanor could not abide. Aquitaine was hers by right, not something Henry had given her, not something he could take away. And then there were their sons. Henry had a plan for his succession. In 1169 he divided his vast empire among 3 of his sons, deliberately excluding the youngest, John, which earned John the nickname Lackland. Henry the young king would get England, Normandy and Anjou. Richard would get Aquitaine. Geoffrey would get Brittany through his marriage to its heiress. It seemed like a neat division, keeping the empire intact across a generation. But there was a problem. Young Henry was crowned as king-elect in 1170, given the title of king while his father still lived. This was meant to secure the succession, to make clear who would rule after Henry II died. But young Henry reacted by complaining that his title was empty, that his father was preventing him from actually ruling anything. He had been given the title of king, but none of the power. His brothers had similar complaints. Richard had been given Aquitaine, but Eleanor was still alive and still very much Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. Geoffrey had Brittany, but only through marriage, and his wife's family complicated things. All 3 young men felt that they had been promised power, but were being denied it by their still vigorous father. Eleanor, for her part, had her own grievances against Henry. He was interfering in Aquitaine, trying to control lands that were rightfully hers. He had humiliated her with his affair with Rosamond Clifford. He had marginalised her politically, treating her more like a possession than a partner. After 14 years of producing heirs, Eleanor was done. In 1167 she separated from Henry and moved her household permanently to Poitiers, taking her younger sons with her. For the next several years Eleanor ruled Aquitaine essentially independently, while Henry focused on England and his northern French territories. It was during this period that her court at Poitiers reached its cultural peak, but beneath the surface rebellion was brewing. In 1173 the simmering tensions finally exploded into open warfare. Young Henry, encouraged and supported by King Louis VII of France, who saw an opportunity to weaken his rival, fled his father's court and raised the standard of rebellion. He was quickly joined by his brothers Richard and Geoffrey. Eleanor supported the revolt. Why did Eleanor support her son's rebellion against their father? The sources don't give us a clear answer. Medieval chroniclers, who generally disapproved of Eleanor, were quick to blame her, suggesting she was the instigator of the whole affair. Some modern historians have argued that she was motivated by revenge for Henry's treatment of her, particularly his interference in Aquitaine. Others suggest she was genuinely concerned about her sons' futures, believing that Henry needed to grant them real power before it was too late. Probably it was a combination of factors. Eleanor had always been willing to act decisively in pursuit of her goals, even when those actions were risky or unconventional. She had political grievances against Henry. She had concerns about her son's inheritances. She may also have simply believed that the time had come for Henry to step aside, at least partially, and let the next generation begin to rule. Whatever her motivations, Eleanor threw her considerable resources behind the rebellion. She provided military support, financial backing, and political legitimacy. With the Queen of England and Duchess of Aquitaine openly supporting the revolt, other nobles felt emboldened to join. The rebellion spread across the Angevin Empire and into France itself, with Louis VII providing substantial support. But Henry II was not a man to be easily defeated. Despite facing enemies on multiple fronts, despite fighting his own sons, despite the defection of numerous nobles, Henry managed to hold his empire together and gradually suppress the rebellion. His forces won battle after battle. His enemies' coalition began to fracture. By 1174, it was clear the rebellion was failing. Eleanor, realizing that she was about to face her husband's wrath, attempted to flee to the French court of her ex-husband Louis, seeking sanctuary. But she was captured while trying to cross the border, allegedly disguised in men's clothing. She was brought before Henry. Henry faced a dilemma. His sons he could and would forgive. They were young. They had been led astray by bad advisers. They were his heirs. But Eleanor was different. Eleanor was his wife. She was supposed to support him, and she had openly rebelled against him. For a brief moment, Henry considered divorcing her, but he quickly realized the problem with that plan. If he divorced Eleanor, he would lose Aquitaine. Her lands would revert to her, and she could do with them as she pleased. She could even remarry, creating a new enemy for Henry to fight. So Henry chose a different solution. He would keep Eleanor as his wife, maintaining his claim to Aquitaine, but he would imprison her. For the next 16 years, from 1174 until Henry's death in 1189, Eleanor would remain Henry's prisoner, moved between various strongholds in England, never allowed to return to her beloved Aquitaine. The imprisonment of Eleanor of Aquitaine is one of the great tragedies of her story, but it's important to understand what medieval imprisonment meant, especially for a queen. Eleanor wasn't thrown into a dungeon and forgotten like some common criminal. She was held in what the period called honourable confinement, moving between various royal residences including Old Sarum in Wiltshire, Winchester Castle, and other fortresses throughout England. She had her own household, with servants to attend to her needs, chaplains to say mass, ladies-in-waiting for company. She received fine clothes and relative comfort. The financial records from the period paint a picture of captivity that was physically comfortable, but psychologically devastating. The Sheriff of Wiltshire, for example, spent large amounts between 1175 and 1180 on the Queen's upkeep at Old Sarum. Regular deliveries of fine fabrics arrived from London. She received expensive clothing, furs for the winter, silks and velvets. The pipe rolls, the financial records of the English Exchequer, meticulously document these expenditures, giving us a window into her daily life during these years. But comfortable captivity is still captivity. Eleanor could not leave. She could not rule Aquitaine, the duchy that was hers by right of birth, the land she had governed with such skill before her imprisonment. She could not participate in politics, could not influence the decisions that were shaping the future of the Angevin Empire she had helped create. She could not see her children except on those rare occasions when Henry permitted it, using her children as leverage to ensure her continued docility, for a woman who had been one of the most powerful and active political figures in Europe, who had ruled kingdoms and commanded the loyalty of thousands, who had made kings and unmade them. This enforced idleness must have been torture of a different kind. She was not suffering physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, she was being slowly suffocated. Her world had shrunk from the vast expanses of the Angevin Empire to the walls of whatever castle currently held her. Imagine it for a moment. Eleanor was in her early 50s when she was imprisoned, still vigorous, still sharp, still capable of great things. she watched from behind stone walls as the world moved on without her. She heard news, second-hand, filtered through her jailers about what was happening in the realm. Her sons were growing up, pursuing their ambitions, fighting their wars, and she could do nothing but listen and wait. During these years, Eleanor watched helplessly as her children grew to adulthood and pursued their own destinies, often destructively. She was occasionally allowed out for important ceremonial occasions, brief respites that must have made the return to captivity all the more painful. In 1176, she was permitted to travel to Winchester to say goodbye to her youngest daughter Joanna, then just 11 years old, who was being sent to Sicily to marry King William II. Eleanor had to watch her baby daughter leave for a foreign land, knowing she might never see her again. And then she had to return to her prison. In 1184 she was allowed to cross the Channel to take possession of certain castles as part of some political manoeuvring by Henry, accompanied by her daughter Matilda, who had fled an abusive marriage to Henry the Lion of Saxony. For a brief moment mother and daughter were reunited, able to comfort each other. Matilda even petitioned Henry to ease the restrictions on Eleanor's confinement. Henry, perhaps softened by his daughter's pleas, did allow Eleanor slightly more freedom of movement. But these were brief respites, small mercies in a sea of frustration and loss. Always, Eleanor had to return to her captivity. Meanwhile, her sons continued to give Henry the troubles he had feared, proving that imprisoning Eleanor had done nothing to solve his problems with his fractious offspring. Young Henry, never satisfied with his empty title of king-elect, rebelled again in 1183, this time with the support of his brother Geoffrey. The revolt failed, and young Henry fled to the court of Philip of France, but on his way there he fell ill with dysentery. By the time he died on June 11th, 1183, at just 28 years old, he had reconciled with his father, confessing his sins and asking forgiveness. Eleanor, locked away in England, heard the news of her son's death second-hand, unable to go to him, unable to comfort him in his final hours, unable to attend his funeral. It must have been agonizing. Young Henry had been her firstborn son with King Henry, the second, the heir to the Angevin Empire. She had nurtured his ambitions, had supported his desire for real power, and now he was dead, cut down in his prime. And she hadn't even been able to say goodbye. 3 years later, in 1186, came even worse news. Geoffrey, her third son with Henry, died in Paris at just 28 years old, either in a jousting accident or from a sudden heart attack. The sources disagree on the cause, but the result was the same. Another son dead, another funeral she could not attend, another grief she had to bear alone in her captivity. Geoffrey left behind a pregnant wife, Constance of Brittany, who would give birth to a son, Arthur, 6 months after his father's death. This posthumous grandson would become, years later, a key player in the succession crisis that followed Richard's death. But in 1186, Eleanor had no way of knowing this. She knew only that another of her sons was dead, that the family she'd built was being torn apart while she watched helplessly from imprisonment. By the late 1180s, the Angevin Empire was fracturing. Richard, now heir to the throne after the deaths of his brothers, was in open conflict with his father over Aquitaine and other territories. John, the youngest son, was Henry's favourite, and this favouritism caused tension with Richard. Philip of France, who had succeeded his father Louis in 1180, was masterfully exploiting these divisions, playing father against sons, brother against brother. Henry II, who had ruled for 35 years and built one of the most powerful empires in European history, was exhausted, ill, and increasingly isolated. In June 1189, Richard and Philip forced him into submission at Ballon. Henry was compelled to accept humiliating terms, including recognising Richard as his heir and agreeing to go on crusade with Philip. When Henry asked for a list of those barons who had betrayed him to his sons, the first name on the list was John, his favourite son, the one he had trusted most. Henry died at Chinon on July 6th, 1189. His last words were reportedly bitter curses against all his children. He died humiliated, defeated, betrayed by the son he loved most, many of his supposed allies having deserted him for Richard and Philip. It was a sad, ignoble end for a man who had once seemed destined for greatness. One of Richard's very first acts as King Richard I of England was to free his mother from imprisonment. The order went out immediately. Eleanor was to be released, her confinement ended, her freedom restored. Eleanor of Aquitaine was 67 years old, an advanced age in the medieval world where life expectancy hovered around 45. She had been imprisoned for 16 years, more than a decade and a half of her life locked away, her powers and influence deliberately suppressed by her own husband. Most people, after such an ordeal, especially at such an age, would have been content to retire quietly, to spend their remaining years in prayer and peace at some abbey, perhaps Fontevraud, preparing their souls for the afterlife. Eleanor was emphatically not most people. She exploded into a frenzy of political activity that would define the last 15 years of her extraordinary life and prove that age had not dimmed her formidable abilities one bit. Richard trusted his mother completely, more than he trusted anyone else in the world. He wasn't in England when his father died, having spent the last weeks of Henry's life in France alongside Philip, forcing his father to surrender. So Eleanor acted as de facto regent until Richard could arrive to claim his throne. She travelled throughout England with an energy that belied her age, visiting castles and towns, receiving oaths of loyalty to the new king from nobles and bishops, who knew that defying Eleanor was tantamount to defying Richard himself. One of her first acts demonstrates both her political savvy and her personal compassion born of her own long captivity. She released prisoners throughout England, understanding their plight in a way that only someone who had endured years of imprisonment could truly understand. She issued orders for the release of prisoners held under forest law, those who had been punished for poaching deer or taking wood from royal forests. It was a calculated political move designed to win popular support for the new regime, but it was also an act of genuine empathy. Eleanor knew what it meant to lose your freedom. She was not about to let others suffer needlessly if she could prevent it. She arranged for Richard's coronation, which took place on September 3rd, 1189 at Westminster Abbey. The coronation was spectacular, carefully orchestrated by Eleanor to present Richard as the glorious new king who would usher in an era of peace, justice, and prosperity. Music was commissioned specifically for the occasion, hymns and anthems celebrating the new monarch. Every detail was managed, from the order of precedence in the procession to the exact ceremonial gestures Richard would make during the service. The regalia was polished until it gleamed. The nobles wore their finest clothes. It was pageantry at its finest, designed to inspire awe and reinforce the legitimacy of the new regime. And when the original plan to exclude women from the coronation was proposed, it was relaxed specifically to allow Eleanor to attend, at the request of the nobles of England, as the chronicles record. Her popularity and influence were undeniable. After 16 years of being hidden away, Eleanor of Aquitaine was back in the public eye, and she had no intention of being sidelined again. But Richard had a greater calling. Just 2 years earlier, Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin. The Christian kingdoms in the Holy Land were in desperate straits. Pope Clement III had called for a new crusade, and Richard, who embodied the chivalric ideal perhaps more than any other medieval king, had taken the cross even, before becoming king. He intended to go on crusade, and he intended to retake Jerusalem. This meant leaving England, potentially for years. Richard needed someone he could trust absolutely to manage his kingdom in his absence. He chose his mother. Eleanor was appointed not as regent technically, but simply as the Queen. She signed official documents as Eleanor by the grace of God, Queen of England. She was not ruling in Richard's name, she was ruling. In 1190, Richard departed for the Third Crusade. Eleanor, at 68 years old, became the most powerful person in England, and she handled it masterfully. She managed the government, dealt with the inevitable attempts by her younger son John to seize power in Richard's absence and kept the kingdom stable and prosperous. She foiled plots, maintained the loyalty of the barons, and kept the peace both in England and in her own lands in Aquitaine. But in December 1192, disaster struck. News reached England that Richard, on his way home from the Crusade, had been captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, who had sold him to Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor was demanding an enormous ransom, 100,000 marks, equivalent to perhaps $100 billion in modern money. It was an astronomical sum, roughly twice the annual revenue of the English crown. Eleanor immediately took charge of the situation. She chaired councils to organise the collection of the ransom. She imposed heavy taxes on everything, from land to movable goods. Every penny was counted and locked away under her personal seal. She travelled throughout England, ensuring that the money was being raised. And when the ransom was finally collected, Eleanor didn't trust anyone else to deliver it. At 71 years old, she personally travelled to Germany in the winter of 1193, accompanied by bishops and nobles carrying the massive ransom. They arrived at Speyer in January 1194, only to discover that Philip of France and John had made a counteroffer to the emperor, offering to pay him even more to keep Richard imprisoned. Eleanor, undaunted, negotiated. She arranged for additional payments, including an annual tribute. Finally, on February 4th, 1194, Richard was released. Eleanor and Richard immediately began their journey home, travelling through Cologne and then to Antwerp, where they boarded a ship for England, landing at Sandwich on March 12th. Eleanor had saved her son, saved the kingdom, and demonstrated yet again that she was a political force to be reckoned with. But Richard would only reign for another 5 years before a fateful arrow found him at the siege of Chalus, and Eleanor would face her greatest trial yet. On April 6, 1199, Richard the Lionheart died from an infected wound suffered during the siege. He was 41 years old. He had no legitimate children. The question of succession was immediately thrown into chaos. By the traditional laws of primogeniture, the crown should have passed to Arthur of Brittany, the son of Eleanor's deceased son Geoffrey. Arthur had a strong claim. He was supported by many nobles, and Philip of France eagerly backed him as a way to undermine the Angevin Empire. But Arthur was only 12 years old. He had been raised at the French court under Philip's influence, and Richard himself had changed his mind on his deathbed, naming John as his heir instead. Eleanor made her choice. Despite her well-documented dislike of John, despite knowing his weaknesses better than anyone, she supported him as king. Probably she felt that John, for all his faults, was at least a mature man who could hold the empire together, while Arthur was too young and too influenced by France. Eleanor travelled throughout Aquitaine and Normandy, using her immense prestige and her position as Duchess of Aquitaine to secure support for John. On May 27th, 1199, John was crowned King of England, but Eleanor, now 77 years old, was not done. In 1200 she undertook one of the most remarkable journeys of her entire extraordinary life. John needed to secure peace with Philip of France, and that peace needed to be sealed with a marriage alliance. John's niece, Blanche of Castile, granddaughter of Eleanor through her daughter Eleanor of Castile, was to marry Philip's son Louis. Someone needed to fetch Blanche from Castile and escort her to France. This required crossing the Pyrenees in the dead of winter. Eleanor, at 78 years old, volunteered for the task. In January, in winter weather, this elderly woman crossed the Pyrenees, travelled to Castile, collected her granddaughter, crossed the Pyrenees again on the return journey, and delivered Blanche to her new husband. The marriage would eventually lead to Blanche becoming Queen of France and one of the most formidable rulers of the 13th century, but that's a story for another time. Eleanor returned to Aquitaine exhausted but satisfied. She had secured an alliance that might bring peace. She had found a worthy successor in her granddaughter. She could finally, after 80 years of political struggles and triumphs, think about retiring. But not yet. There was one final battle to fight. In 1202, Eleanor's grandson Arthur of Brittany, now 15 years old and still convinced that he was the rightful king of England, raised an army with French support. He invaded Poitou, and when he learned that Eleanor was travelling from Fontevraud Abbey to Poitiers, he saw an opportunity. Capturing Eleanor would give him an unparalleled bargaining chip. He raced ahead of his main forces and cornered Eleanor at the small town of Mirebeau. Arthur's forces quickly stormed the town walls. Eleanor, with just a small escort, retreated into the keep, essentially a fortified tower. She manned the ramparts with her few troops and refused to surrender, even though she was nearly 80 years old and severely outnumbered. She sent a desperate message to John, who was at Le Mans, 80 miles away. John, for once in his life, acted decisively and bravely. When he received his mother's message, he immediately set out with his forces, riding through both day and night. He covered 80 miles in 48 hours, an extraordinary feat of speed. He reached Mirebeau at dawn on August 1st, 1202, catching Arthur's forces completely by surprise. Many of them had taken off their armour in the heat and were lounging around, confident that they had plenty of time before any relief force could arrive. John's forces poured through the open gates and slaughtered or captured Arthur's army. It was a stunning victory, the only military engagement John would personally command during his entire reign. Arthur himself was captured, along with many of the rebel nobles, including the Lusignan family. Eleanor was saved. Her grandson Arthur was John's prisoner. The rebellion was crushed. Eleanor could finally retire to Fontevraud Abbey, the monastery she had patronised throughout her life, where she would spend her final years in relative peace. But Arthur's fate was darker. John imprisoned the boy at various castles, moving him from Falaise to Rouen. Then, sometime in 1203, Arthur disappeared. He was never seen again. The most likely explanation is that John, fearing Arthur as a rival claimant to the throne, had him murdered. Some sources say John killed Arthur personally in a drunken rage. Others say he ordered it done. We'll never know for certain. But Arthur's disappearance, almost certainly at John's orders, would haunt John for the rest of his reign and contribute to the collapse of the Angevin Empire. Eleanor, whether she knew what John had done or merely suspected, withdrew from politics after Mirebeau. She took the veil at Fontevraud Abbey, the beautiful monastery on the border between Anjou and Poitou, where she had been a patron for decades. Here, she spent her final years in prayer and contemplation, surrounded by the tombs of her husband Henry and her son Richard, who were both buried there. On the 1st of April 1204, Eleanor of Aquitaine died at Fontevraud Abbey. She was 82 years old, an extraordinary age for the medieval period when life expectancy was perhaps 45 years. She had lived through the reigns of 7 kings of France and 6 kings of England. She had been queen consort of 2 different kingdoms. She had given birth to 10 children. She had survived imprisonment, crusades, rebellions, and betrayals. She had shaped the political map of Europe for 3/4 of a century. The Angevin Empire she had helped create died with her. Within months of her death, John lost Normandy to Philip of France. Within a few years, he would lose most of the northern French territories as well. By 1204, all that remained of the vast Angevin holdings in France was Aquitaine itself, Eleanor's own ancestral lands, which remained loyal to England not because of any connection to Normandy or Anjou, but because of their connection to Eleanor and her descendants. So why was Eleanor of Aquitaine the most dangerous woman of the Middle Ages? Let me count the ways, because her danger was multifaceted, operating on multiple levels simultaneously. She was dangerous because she refused to accept the limitations that society placed on women. In an age when women were expected to be silent, submissive, and decorative, Eleanor commanded armies, governed kingdoms, and influenced politics at the highest levels. She married 2 kings and gave birth to 2 more, but she never saw herself as merely an appendage to the men in her life. She was always her own person, acting in pursuit of her own goals. This alone made her threatening to the established order. Medieval society depended on women staying in their assigned roles. Eleanor's refusal to do so challenged the entire social structure. She was dangerous because she controlled wealth and territory on a scale that rivaled kings. Aquitaine was hers by right, not by marriage, and she never forgot that. This gave her a power base independent of her husband's, a fact that terrified men like Louis and Henry, who were used to controlling their wives completely. When most queens derived their power from their relationships to men, Eleanor had her own independent source of legitimacy and authority. She could, and did, act independently when she felt it necessary. That made her unpredictable, uncontrollable, dangerous. She was dangerous because she was willing to rebel, even against her own husband, when she felt her rights or her children's rights were being violated. The revolt of 1173 was a shocking act for a queen, perhaps the most shocking thing she ever did. Medieval society expected wives to be obedient to their husbands in all things. The idea of a wife not only disagreeing with her husband but actively taking up arms against him was almost incomprehensible. It violated every social norm, every expectation, every rule about how women were supposed to behave. But Eleanor supported the rebellion anyway. She chose her principles and her children over her marriage, and she paid the price with 16 years of imprisonment. But she never recanted, never apologized, never admitted she was wrong. She was dangerous because she survived. This might not seem like danger at first glance, but consider. Eleanor outlived both her husbands, most of her children, and many of her enemies. In a world where childbirth alone killed countless women, where disease and violence cut lives short routinely, Eleanor lived to 82. She refused to fade away or retire quietly into some abbey where she could be safely forgotten. Even in her 70s, she was riding across the Pyrenees in winter, negotiating ransoms, defending castles under siege, and shaping the future of Europe. Her sheer endurance meant that she remained a political force for decades longer than anyone expected. You couldn't simply wait for her to die and for the problem she represented to disappear. She just kept going, year after year, outlasting her opponents. She was dangerous because she cultivated cultural power as well as political power. Her patronage of troubadours, poets, and scholars helped shape medieval culture in ways that lasted long after her death. The ideals of courtly love, of chivalry, of romantic literature, all flourished under her protection. She understood that controlling hearts and minds was just as important as controlling land and armies. She understood soft power before the term existed. By shaping culture, she shaped the very way people thought about love, honour, duty, and the proper relationship between men and women. That's a profound kind of influence that goes beyond mere political manoeuvring, and perhaps most dangerously of all, she became a legend. Within decades of her death, stories about Eleanor were being embellished, romanticised, transformed into myth. The courts of love, whether they happened exactly as described or not, became an enduring part of her legend. Her affair with Raymond at Antioch, her rebellion against Henry, her rescue of Richard, all became the stuff of romance and adventure. She became, in the popular imagination, larger than life, the archetypal powerful medieval woman, the queen who refused to know her place. This legendary status made her dangerous in a way that transcended her actual historical actions. She became a symbol, an idea, a possibility. She showed women what could be achieved. She showed men what women were capable of when given the opportunity. To those who admired her, she was a paragon of female independence and capability, proof that women could be just as politically astute, just as strategically brilliant, just as effective as rulers as any man. To those who feared powerful women, she became a cautionary tale about what happens when women are given too much freedom, when the natural order is disrupted, when women forget their place. But separating Eleanor the legend from Eleanor the historical figure is almost impossible now, 900 years after her birth. The records are incomplete, often biased, sometimes contradictory. We have her actions, preserved in charters and chronicles, We have the consequences of those actions written in the political map of Europe. But we don't have her thoughts, her feelings, her private motivations. We don't know what she really felt about Raymond, about Louis, about Henry, about her children. We don't know if she had regrets, or if she would have changed anything if she could. We don't know if she saw herself as a rebel against convention, or simply as a woman trying to protect her rights and her family in a dangerous world. What we do know is this: Eleanor of Aquitaine was a force of nature in human form. She shaped the world she lived in with her bare hands, refused to be constrained by the expectations placed on women of her time, and left a legacy that echoes down through the centuries. She was Queen of France for 15 years, Queen of England for 35 years, Duchess of Aquitaine for 67 years, mother of 10 children including 2 kings, patron of poets and troubadours, crusader, rebel, prisoner, regent, diplomat, and finally, in her old age, a legend in her own lifetime. The Angevin Empire may have died with her, but her influence did not. Her descendants would rule England for centuries. Her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, would become one of the great queens of France. The cultural renaissance she fostered at Poitiers would influence European literature and art for generations. The ideals of courtly love and chivalry that flourished under her patronage would become central to the medieval imagination. She lived in an age of iron and blood, of feudal warfare and religious fervour, of crusades and rebellions. It was an age that did not expect women to be anything more than wives and mothers, silent supporters of their husbands' ambitions. Eleanor rejected that role completely. She carved out her own space, claimed her own power, and dared anyone to try to stop her. That's why she was dangerous. Not because she was evil or cruel, though she could be both when necessary. Not because she was physically threatening, though she did lead armed forces. She was dangerous because she refused to accept the world as it was and insisted on changing it to suit herself. She was dangerous because she showed what women could accomplish when given the opportunity and the will to use it. If you lived in the 12th century and you had to face Eleanor of Aquitaine across a negotiating table, across a battlefield or in a court of law, you should have been very, very afraid. Because this woman, this duchess, this queen, this mother of kings, would do whatever it took to achieve her goals. She would charm you if that worked, outwit you if she could, outmaneuver you politically if necessary, or crush you militarily if all else failed. She was Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she was the most dangerous woman of the Middle Ages. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the life of one of history's most remarkable women, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more incredible stories waiting to be told, so many more forgotten figures who deserve to be remembered. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.